All right, let's dive right into this explainer. Today, we're digging into an incredibly fascinating and honestly somewhat alarming piece of research by Dr. Sanjana Hatotwa. It breaks down exactly how foreign narratives successfully infiltrated New Zealand's domestic politics between 2021 and 2026. It is a wild look at how information mutates, and I guarantee these findings are going to totally shift how you think about the media you consume online. So, to set the stage, we actually have to rewind to late 2022. Former Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern came out with this really stark warning. She publicly called out a sudden, noticeable spike in Russian disinformation that popped up right before some major protests in the country. Now, at the time, this observation drew a lot of pushback and denial from the exact communities she was describing. But as this research points out, she actually understated the problem. And that brings us to, frankly, the core mystery of this entire report. How does foreign propaganda, which, let's be real, usually feels pretty distant and clunky, how does it mutate until it sounds completely local? How does it end up sounding just like your neighbor or a colleague or a trusted local radio host? To unpack this complex viral mutation, we're going to follow a clear roadmap through 5 sections: the prepared ground, from protest to war, how disinformation spreads, sanctions, signal, not shield, and finally, the cost to democracy. Starting right off with Section 1, the prepared ground. Let's take a look at the pre-existing conditions that made this information ecosystem so incredibly vulnerable in the first place. The researchers mapped this whole thing out chronologically. It's wild to track how a local public health crisis back in 2021 steadily evolved across 6 distinct phases. Fast forward to 2026, and it's morphed into a massive geopolitical vulnerability where everyday online chatter is actually altering physical policy. Now, what is absolutely fascinating and maybe a bit scary is that the infrastructure for this foreign influence, it was completely homegrown. It's kind of like planting seeds in already fertile soil. Local anti-vaccine and anti-mandate networks established these deeply receptive audiences, highly resilient Telegram channels, and robust alternative media platforms long before global geopolitics ever entered the chat. They essentially built a culture primed with a settled, deep-rooted hostility toward verifying institutions. Which moves us to Section 2, from protest to war. This is the exact moment where domestic grievances and global geopolitics basically just slammed into each other. The researchers zero in on February 2022 as the decisive entry point. Russian state media, specifically RT News, actively framed the New Zealand parliament occupation for its massive global audience. They took this local protest and linked it directly to the Canadian trucker convoy, portraying the whole thing as part of this grand worldwide rebellion against liberal democratic governments. Get this. That single RT Telegram post racked up nearly 110,000 views. It instantly tied a localized domestic grievance to an international narrative. And the craziest part of all this? It happened without any direct, state-run chain of command. Local platforms simply picked up that framing on their own and carried it right into the domestic ecosystem. So right after the invasion of Ukraine, something shifted. Local producers didn't just share Russian articles anymore, they started fully synthesizing them. By April 2022, horrifying events like the Bucha mass graves were natively denied within local channels. The war in Ukraine was completely reframed as Western manipulation, and this was entirely led by domestic actors with zero direct funding from Moscow. All right, Section 3, how disinformation spreads. Let's look at the actual mechanics of how this stuff travels and evolves within an ecosystem, again, without needing a formal budget or direct orders from the top. The report outlines this highly resilient platform relay system. Think of it like a digital narrative assembly line. First, Telegram incubates raw claims without much moderation. Next, alternative media websites pick them up and give them a polished, published look. Then Facebook scales it by testing that messaging out on everyday people. Finally, platforms like X push those same claims directly into elite-facing political discourse. If one platform drops a post, no big deal. The rest of the ecosystem just carries the load. To really get a handle on this threat, we need to understand a concept called narrative laundering. It's exactly what it sounds like. Just like laundering money, this is how state messaging is washed to look completely grassroots. By the time an RT frame reached a local audience, it had already passed through a foreign influencer, maybe a local blog, and a live stream. It emerges on the other side looking like an organic, trusted voice. Next up is semantic infiltration. This is a genuinely brilliant, albeit totally unsettling tactic. Local actors hijack universally loved words,
words like freedom or sovereignty, and they weaponize them against democratic institutions. They use anti-war language to actually excuse aggression, which subtly makes extreme ideas sound totally reasonable to their followers.
And finally, we have inversion. This right here is what makes the whole system practically bulletproof. It automatically recasts any official fact check, journalistic report, or academic research as a malicious, government-led attack. Think about how frustrating this is if you're trying to debate these topics online. It literally flips the script, turning the very people trying to correct the record into the villains. Section 4, Sanctions, Signal, not Shield. Keeping those tricky mechanics in mind, let's look at why traditional government defensive tools are kind of dropping the ball here. There is just a massive, stark mismatch here. Official government sanctions act like this heavy, blunt instrument designed to crush formal Russian entities, TV channels, and bank accounts. But the actual disinformation? It's buzzing through informal, scattered networks of local phones, Telegram channels, alternative radio hosts, proxy influencers. The law simply does not touch these domestic actors. The findings make it crystal clear. Taking down an official state media post, it literally doesn't matter if a local radio host is already enthusiastically repeating that exact same talking point. Legal limits cannot block a screenshot or a subtitled video shared in a private group chat. Because of timing delays, the narrative templates have already settled locally. So sanctions have acted as a signal that the state cares, sure, but they absolutely do not act as a shield against the narratives themselves. And that leads us to our final section, Section 5, the cost to democracy. What actually happens to a society when these localized narratives take permanent root? The study's conclusions leading up to 2026 are eye-opening. These imported narratives became so deeply entrenched that they started directly impacting real on-the-ground policy action. For instance, the rejection of World Health Organization treaty amendments happened against official government and scientific advice. And it was driven almost entirely by the exact sovereignty language this ecosystem had been rehearsing for years. This brings us to what might be the deepest, most troubling issue identified in the whole research, the total collapse of institutional distinction. In this disinformation ecosystem, courts, mainstream media, and public health bodies are no longer seen as separate entities with different functions. Instead, they're all viewed as one single imagined hostile plot. And if every institution belongs to the same plot, well, no evidence from any institution can ever correct the narrative. So how do we counter this? Dr. Hadatua's research recommends systemic responses. The ultimate goal is to protect and essentially rebuild the very institutions that everyday people can still actually believe in and rely on. We can't just play whack-a-mole with false claims all day. We have to address the social vulnerabilities that are allowing these claims to flourish in the first place. Here are the practical, whole-of-society steps proposed to shield democracy. First, we've got to treat foreign information manipulation and interference as a complex, hybrid threat, not just a communications nuisance. Governments need to require disinformation risk notes for major policies. We need much stricter financial transparency for alternative media that's profiting off of these grievances. And crucially, we have got to build robust media literacy straight into public schools so citizens can spot this narrative laundering for themselves. Which leaves us with one final, incredibly critical thought to ponder. The absolute most potent foreign influence operations, they don't look like foreign spies. They look and sound exactly like us. They sound like a colleague, a local broadcaster, or a comment right under your daily news story. When the threat is this deeply localized, where do we even begin to defend the truth? It's a massive challenge for any digital citizen today, but understanding the mechanics we've explored right now, that's the first vital step.